Hello, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Raymond Nicolet Trust Podcast. My name is Gavrilo Nikolic, and every month I bring you inspiring conversations about the future of education, science, and philanthropy from world top academics, scientists, Nobel Prize winners, and philanthropists. My guest today is Professor Dejan Djokic. Dejan is a professor of modern and contemporary history at Goldsmiths University of London. Dejan completed Bachelor studies in history at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at the University of London in 1996, and then obtained PhD in history from the University College of London in 2004. Prior to joining Goldsmiths in 2007, Dejan held lectureships at Birkbeck and Nottingham and research fellowships at Columbia University, New York, and Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Dejan's research interests lay in the following areas: the Yugoslav wars, global and cultural history of the Cold War, history of Southeastern Europe since the Middle Ages. I hope that he will be able to give us a glimpse of what he does between these research areas in the minutes to come. If you're curious to learn more about Dejan and his work, you need to listen to this episode. In just a moment, the one and only Professor Dejan Djokic. Dejan, welcome to the RNT podcast.
Thank you, Gavrilo, for such a generous introduction, and good to be here.
Thank you for agreeing to be part of our RNT podcast. And before we start with discussion around your vocation and what does it mean to be a historian, how one historian lives and works, let us start with basics and one warm-up question. Where are you currently and what are you doing as we speak?
Yes, currently I'm in my office in Berlin. I currently hold a guest professorship at Humboldt University of Berlin. And I'm also currently a Leverhulme research fellow. I have received a research fellowship from the Leverhulme Trust, the UK Leverhulme Trust, which enabled me to be away from my normal teaching and other duties at Goldsmiths College in London. So I'm here. I have actually just recently finished a big book. I say big because it's 160,000 words. I make no other claims to greatness, except that in volume it is quite big. It's a history of Serbia since the early Middle Ages until the present day, which is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, actually, within a few months. And at the moment, I'm also working on another project, which is funded by the Leverhulme Trust and also by the British Academy. And this is a kind of the story of the last generation of the Yugoslav People's Army soldiers, of whom I was one.
That's interesting. I'm sure that book will definitely attract some attention because it's a generation of an army of a country that ceased to exist a couple of months afterwards. But I'm sure we'll get back to that in the minutes to come. But let us first get back to the origin of your story. What prompted you really to study history and eventually become a historian?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because historians also have their own history. But I became a historian almost by chance, really. Well, if you want to, due to historical circumstances, I actually moved to Britain in 1992. So now this was at the time of the disintegration and war in Yugoslavia. And I actually initially just simply wanted to get away from all of it, but not necessarily. I did not have any huge plans. I didn't know what to expect. And at some point during that first year, I realized that maybe actually even before, I realized that I will likely stay a little bit longer. And I already did, I was doing several part-time jobs or several full-time jobs at times in nightclubs or pubs as a barman. And I realized that really I need to make a little bit more out of this opportunity or this situation in which I found myself. And thanks to, it was at the time, studying in Britain was much cheaper. Student fees were, for home students, meaning UK and European students, were maybe just over £1,000 a year. And thanks to the generosity of a university which no longer exists, sadly, a University of North London, which had a campus around Holloway Road, I was granted some sort of I think it was a scheme that was called something like Overseas Research Support Scheme for students who came from overseas. So I actually didn't have to pay this huge this difference was covered. So my fees would only be let's say just over £1,000, and I could pay in several installments. So that enabled me to enroll into a history degree at the University of North London to start with. Now, why history? In secondary school back in Yugoslavia, in Serbia, I actually liked history, but it wasn't necessarily my favorite subject. My favorite subject was philosophy, but I didn't think my English was good enough to get involved, to engage in complex philosophical debates. And I always had a reasonably good memory. And like I said, I liked history. So I thought I would be able to remember dates and facts and big leaders and battles. But very soon I realized that this is not what history is about, certainly not in the UK. I was lucky that this small department was actually a very good department. Among professors who taught me in year one was John Tosh, who is the author of one of the best books on the philosophy of history, of what is history. So very quickly I realized that actually I had to engage in complex discussions, that simply knowing facts it was not enough. History is not a sequence of events, certainly not if you study at a British university. And initially I was also interested in a broader kind of world history and European history. But during the first year, I also realized that actually I was drawn more and more to Balkan and East European history. I was very lucky that I had at the University of North London professors such as Ben Fowkes, who is an expert on Eastern Europe. And they encouraged me, they told me about the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. That it was at that time an autonomous college of the University of London, and then later it was merged with UCL, which is also a college of the University of London. So to cut a long story short, I transferred during my studies to SEAS, School of Slavonic Studies, as you said, and I graduated there. And it was really during that second and third year of my studies, thanks to tutors who were very encouraging at SEAS, but also thanks to meeting Professor Stevan Pavlovic, who sadly died earlier this year, but he was the leading expert on Yugoslav and Balkan history in Britain, who also encouraged me to pursue postgraduate studies. And none of that would have been possible without, I had some small funding, but not really a proper funding. At the time, being from Serbia, without any status, Serbia is under sanctions, that was not so easy. But thanks to somebody called Vane Ivanovic, who was a Yugoslav kind of businessman and a diplomat and also a philanthropist, he supported a small number of students from former Yugoslavia. So I received some funding to begin my PhD, and later on I managed to get some other. So it was kind of a struggle to really stay and survive in London, but also it was interesting, and history kind of enabled me to do that.
It's quite interesting to hear that also your personal history is not a sequence of events, but also involving a lot of philosophical questions, what to do with my life and how to pursue my postgraduate studies in what way. Speaking of your postgraduate studies, I would like to pick up on your large span of research interests, if I could call it that way, which is not something we see every day. So I would like to ask you, what motivates you actually to research at the same time, or more or less at the same time, Cold War, Yugoslav wars, and the history of Southeast Europe since Middle Ages?
Thank you. That's a good question. It's an interesting question because it also depends how do you look at this question. Now, just in recent months, I have been actually told the same by a fellow scholar of former Yugoslavia who didn't think that one should necessarily venture out of one's original expertise. So my PhD and my first book, even my second book actually, was about interwar Yugoslavia and about nationalism and national question and mainly Serb-Croat relations within the context of interwar Europe. But I have since moved on, as you said, to several other, and actually not only in terms of chronological boundaries. I have expanded my research interest methodologically also. So initially I did mostly political history, also history of nationalism. So let's say social. I was also in dialogue with disciplines such as sociology and political science. But since then, I have also developed interest in other chronological areas, but also in different methodologies. I will talk a little bit later on about this project on the army, which is very much collective autobiography, as I call it. It's methodologically a novel approach, I think. But also I'm interested in cultural history, in diplomacy as a political theater. So a colleague, a fellow Yugoslav historian, recently told me that this is maybe a bad idea, and asked me, why do you do this? This is too wide. But then I have also been in situations in which I have been told, admittedly by historians who don't work on the Balkans, why should one only focus on the Balkans? Is that enough really to understand the rest of Europe? And can you actually really teach European history or even Central European history if you're only working on the Balkans? So from that point of view, this is too narrow, maybe. Now, historians of France and Germany never get asked these questions, but historians of the Balkans often ask these questions. Now, really, my point, I'm probably in a good position. I have a permanent post, and I'm in a position in my career in which I can actually do what I like to do. And this was always something I could always do that anyway, but I can, and so I'm pursuing those questions that interest me, regardless of any other considerations. Whether this is too broad or too narrow, I don't think it's too narrow, but and also regardless of any current trends, even though I of course follow the recent trends in historiography, this is important and it's necessary, but I pursue the things that interest me. Now, maybe to briefly finish this question, why, because another sub-question maybe, or follow-up question maybe, why if I specialized originally in 20th century history, I'm a modernist by training, why now go back to the early Middle Ages? Well, this was while writing this history of Serbia that I actually realized that in order to understand Serbia, I first had to really seriously study the 19th century, which I had not done research on before. And then I realized I had to go a little bit back to understand the early modern period. And then, of course, I had to go back to the Middle Ages. And then I became fascinated with. So I see, again, the answer is I pursued my own interest. And luckily, I have been supported by my Cambridge University Press editor and also by other colleagues who have read and commented on my work. But this hopefully explains. So basically, these are my interests, and I don't know what will happen in future, but I still see myself as a historian of former Yugoslavia and of Serbia, but I understand it increasingly in wider contexts, and both chronological but also geographical.
Thank you for explaining that. I think it's a great segue into dissecting all of these research interests who are also, I would say, science in their own. So let us start with the obvious aspect with which you started and with which we started these conversations. It's about your interest in Yugoslav wars. How this started and what actually do you research under this research interest, if I could call it that way?
Well, I actually long refused to do that. So I actually, as I said, my PhD was on interwar Yugoslavia. Now, I did it in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when almost nobody worked on that. I can think of two other scholars that I kind of knew at the time. Everybody was interested in the collapse of Yugoslavia and the war in Yugoslavia. And then later on, my colleagues and other scholars of the region became really interested in transitional justice, but I was never really into that. I thought it would be important to try not to read history backwards and ipso facto, but post factum, but to try to understand maybe why did Yugoslavia why did the Yugoslavs form a common country in the first place, rather than look at why the country disintegrated as everybody else was doing. But as I said, recently I have developed other interests, and I participated in the Yugoslav war. I'm a participant in the war in Slovenia. I was a Yugoslav army conscript when the war broke out. So overnight, from a soldier who was in his own country, I became a member of an occupying force from the point of view of the local population, which sought independence at the time. And I think I also increasingly became interested in this kind of autobiographical turn in history. There has been some some kind of other works in recent years by scholars who write about their own lives and kind of trying to understand, their area of inquiry that way. And I think this became attractive to me. But like I said, I'm in a position in which I follow my own interests. So I was actually contacted by some former fellow soldiers with whom I had totally lost touch. This was a few years ago, who created a Facebook group, which is closed for public, only for members of this military unit. And they came from different parts of former Yugoslavia. And it was actually quite touching to see this virtual reunion. So many of them, it was very clear to me very early on, fought against each other in subsequent wars in Bosnia in particular. But that was never a topic of discussion. The only topics of discussion were these jokes from the early days of the army and various anecdotes and how people remembered. And I realized also that people remember different things, but mostly positive things. So I began to wonder, why is this so? I mean, is there something that I was not so interested in this nostalgia for Yugoslavia, nostalgia for the army. These topics have been done already by others, and that will be part of my study, but not the main part. I'm more interested in how do we actually remember this. And I realized also that, like I said, quite a lot of people have written about the disintegration and the war in Yugoslavia. But most of those works, not all, but most of them are from the perspective of high politics, of political institutions, of the collapse of elite consensus about Yugoslavia, about intellectual elites. But very few people have actually tried to understand it from the experience of those who actually went through this process. So my study is in many ways kind of a sensory history, a history of emotions. It's been quite emotional also. So since then I have met quite a few of these former fellow soldiers, and I have interviewed some of them as part of my current project. So I'm doing it both as a participant, as somebody who was one of them, but also as a scholar. And so I have this kind of collective biography component, but also very strong autobiographical component, as well as kind of microhistory. I realized that this location where we spent 1 year in this army barracks in Ljubljana, that now capital of Slovenia, is almost like a sacred place. It's extremely important. And I happen to be the only one from this group who actually returned there to Ljubljana and to this barracks. Much later, as part of my work, I was invited by fellow historians from Slovenia to present some other work, but I kind of went there and saw it. And I realized that when I revealed this to this group, they became totally fascinated. So I'm also interested in this kind of the importance of the space where we actually spent 1 year together as Yugoslavia around us was collapsing. But within this barracks, it was still, Tito's Yugoslavia was still just about preserved for a few months longer. And Tito, of course, is another kind of character in the story because he comes back in almost all of these recollections, even though he had been dead for 10 years. So he's some sort of a divine figure, which is there. So the project is called Tito's Last Soldiers.
That's quite interesting. And I just want to make an analogy with another thing. So I recently read a book called Geopolitics of Emotions. And the way you mentioned in the history of emotions, it's quite interesting to actually make an analogy between both of these, because emotions actually impact the geopolitics, and geopolitics is actually something that will be history tomorrow. So it's quite interesting to actually make a triangle out of these three acronyms, and then in the end they interplay with each other and lead, as I mentioned, to something that will be called history tomorrow. Speaking of those emotions, let us switch then to your other research interest, which is Cold War. And maybe on this one, we could discuss more about what lessons can we actually draw from Cold War and use it for what someone would call these days Cold War II currently happening over the Ukraine.
Okay, so my interest in the Cold War, I think there are two main, so again, to perhaps kind of confirm what you said earlier. I have a relatively wide array of interests, but so in terms of studying Cold War, I have approached it from two different angles at two different stages of my career. Relatively early on, while I was still a doctoral student, I became very interested in Milovan Djilas, the most famous Yugoslav and East European dissident, and also in some other kind of alternative marginal voices that are almost totally absent, completely absent from the historiography, but are nevertheless very important. And I mean people like your listeners or viewers would not necessarily know, but there was a group of pro-Yugoslav, pro-democracy dissidents and emigres who lived in Britain during the Cold War. People like Desimir Tosic or Vana Ivanovic, whom I mentioned earlier, and some of whom I knew and talked with. In some cases, I inherited their private papers, and I have edited a book on Desimir Tosic and Božidar Vlajic and a journal called Oslobođenje, which was a kind of a very intellectual pro-Yugoslav, pro-democracy monthly that was published first in Paris and then in London between 1948 and 1990. So this is one strand. I was interested in these intellectuals, dissidents, alternative voices during the Cold War. But more recently, I'm actually interested in cultural history of the Cold War. I'm interested in this summits. So again, quite a few historians now work on non-alignment, on Yugoslavia as a non-aligned nation. But again, I'm not so interested in this kind of high politics of this. I'm more interested in how this was actually a performative aspects of these summits. And so I have recently written a chapter for a book that will be published also by Cambridge University Press, looking at President Tito of Yugoslavia and President Sukarno of Indonesia and their meetings, and I'm analyzing several images and putting them in a wider context. So this is my interest in the Cold War. So perhaps a little bit disappointing. I'm not so interested in this great power rivalry and nuclear weaponry and campaigns for disarmament and so on. I am, however, interested in non-alignment as a kind of an alternative way in world politics in which, Yugoslavia and several countries, then recently independent Asian and African countries, sought to find another kind of way to kind of resolve this conflict between the two major ideological blocs. Now, what lessons we can draw from this? This is not so easy because I don't know if this is. I mean, in history you can draw analogies, but contexts are always different. So. Is this war now a continuation of the Cold War in some ways, or revival of the Cold War, or is it an entirely new conflict, or is this the continuation of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, or is it an entirely new conflict because we have the pandemic? The world is very different since the pandemic. The economic crisis largely as a result of the war in Ukraine, but not only. These are difficult questions, and I would not necessarily be able to answer them right now. Maybe one lesson that historians can learn from their predecessors who wrote during the Cold War is to try to be historians and to see, complexity of the situation rather than to offer sometimes simple answers are actually the only answers, but not always. So try to remain scholars and historians. Maybe that's a lesson.
That's quite an interesting approach, and I definitely agree with you on that non-aligned position, which is something we are not seeing these days. So it's definitely something that will, if we call it that way, Cold War 2.0 will look differently in the end compared to the first version of it or the start of it. You never know, maybe in the end we'll find out in 30 years that Cold War never ceased to exist, the first one, and that we were wrong thinking differently. Switching to Southeast Europe, why, actually, let me start with that part of the question, why it is important to study the history in general and the history of Southeast Europe specifically, something on which we did not touch so far?
Mhm. That sounds like a question that I'm sometimes asked at an open day at Goldsmiths when potential students or their parents ask me this. Well, I think so first of all, I'm not one of those historians who would say you must only study history. One should study history if one is interested in history. History helps us understand, I think, why we are here where we are. Um, it's a study of past societies, but it's also very much a study of our societies as well. Um, Also, if one by studying history, one doesn't necessarily have to stop or not study other disciplines. History goes very well together with anthropology, sociology, politics. Certainly at Goldsmiths, where I'm currently based, this multidisciplinary approach is strongly encouraged. Um, Now, why Southeastern Europe? Well, the question is why not? Southeastern Europe is a region which is always kind of seen as a place where history is very complicated, very long, and somehow not really part of European wider European history. So I think it's a challenge for a historian such as myself to try to see whether this is really true and maybe challenge some of these stereotypes, if you wish. Now, nobody's ever, if one is a historian of France or Germany or Britain, maybe also, they never asked really this question: why should one study this? And historians of these countries tend to be also those historians who write histories of Europe. But if you look at these histories, many of them are quite Western-centric. So why not approach history of Europe from a different angle? Which is, from the Southeast European periphery. And I think that could lead to some interesting answers to these questions that we are asking why. And Southeastern Europe also, I mean, that term, we use Southeastern Europe, but there's also Balkans. So do we say the Balkans or Southeastern Europe? It has, especially the Balkans, it has a very strong political connotation as well. Perhaps more than some other parts of Europe. So these are all interesting questions. But what I tell my students, because vast majority of my students would not necessarily become specialists in Southeastern Europe or Yugoslavia. They simply take that option because they're interested, or maybe there is nothing else they can take that, within their timetable. But I tell them that they actually don't need to remember all these difficult names and events, especially names that sometimes students struggle with. The important thing is to actually try to understand why certain things happened, what were the consequences, to try to also be aware that there are almost always different interpretations by different historians about the same event. And Southeastern Europe actually is a good case study for this. This would help. This is one of those so-called transferable skills. They can use that skill to study another part of Europe or the world. And I think Southeastern Europe is a good practice for that. There are quite a lot of different controversies and different interpretations about the same events, really. But this is what history is about.
Exactly, it's all about interpretations and learning from the mistakes of others, so that we do not make mistakes next time when we are challenged with a similar situation. Moving on to your literary work that we already mentioned, like your book, you're currently working on Peter's Last Soldiers. You've wrote a vast number, not only books, but also articles. If I would ask you, could you single out one, maybe a few, that our audience needs to get acquainted with?
I would say one is enough, and this is A Concise History of Serbia, which is coming out with Cambridge University Press in January. It's neither so concise, as I already said, it's actually 160,000 words, so it's a kind of, essentially, it's a de facto a two-volume book. And it's not always a history of Serbia, because during this period that I cover, for much of this period, Serbia did not exist as a state. But nevertheless, it's a history of, if you wish, of Southeastern Europe since the early Middle Ages until today, focusing on Serbia and the Serbs. And in the book, I'm quite interested in this transnational and trans-imperial or cross-imperial contacts and transfers, cultural transfers. And I think this is perhaps the most important work I have written so far. Hopefully the next one on the army will be an even more important, but that one is still not there. This is in very much in progress. But basically a concise history of Serbia. It can already be pre-ordered through Cambridge and Amazon. In fact, it was about to come out within a couple of weeks, but there has been a slight delay in production. But it will be out in January.
We'll make sure to put a link below in the description of the video so everyone can click and pre-order it or order it by the time this will be out.
Yes.
Speaking generally about your profession is something I'm personally interested in, but I believe a lot of our listeners. How does a life of a historian actually looks like? Can you make example of of your regular days, knowing that, of course, in every profession, there is no such a thing as a regular day?
There is no such thing as a regular day, exactly. And basically with academics, I would say in particular, so if I'm at the university, if I'm actually during term time, if I'm not on research leave, I basically have three jobs in one. One is to teach, obviously, this is the most obvious. So if I often tend to group my teaching into 2 or 3 days a week. So I would go to work and teach sometimes all day and meet students. I have a large number of personal tutees. I'm a personal tutor to students who I don't always teach, but I would meet them. And this is obviously pre-pandemic. So, but there is also research. So Goldsmiths is one of those institutions where teaching is informed very much by research. So quite a lot of my teaching is based on the research I do. So I'm expected, but I want to do research. So when I don't have to go to my office in New Cross, I either work from home or I work in a library, British library or an archive. And I've been spending time in Berlin, so I would often go to Staatsbibliothek, the state library in Berlin. And thirdly, and this is something that most people don't know, there is quite a lot of administrative work to be done if you're an academic in Britain. And in between, let's say, 2009 and 2019, for a whole decade, I was in charge of my department's research policies. I was the research director. So that meant that was mainly in order to lead our submission to something called Research Excellence Framework, but not only that, it was more than that. So it involved basically attending a lot of meetings and writing a lot of kind of reports or thinking about future research direction. So, but when I'm on study leave, as I'm now, I obviously have much more time to read and to write and to maybe attend conferences and seminars, which I do also when I'm teaching, of course. So this is important to disseminate your work. So it really, sorry, this is not a good answer, but it all depends. I mean, I can tell you that I can reveal maybe exclusively for you and for your audience a guilty pleasure that I have, that how I start my day almost every day. I check basketball results from the NBA and especially Denver Nuggets results to see how Nikola Jokic performed. And I know Nikola Jokic is one of your patrons, I think, of the Raymond Nicolet Trust. So I was very pleased when you approached me to see that connection. So this is something I do first thing when I'm drinking coffee and still waking up. I used to listen to world news, but it's so depressing now that I still do that, but I first check basketball results from the previous night in the NBA.
Obviously, at that point of time, there are also history, so it's a part of your vocation in the end of the day.
It is. Actually, my book on Serbia does have a little bit of sports in there. It's not just political history, it's a social history as well. So I mentioned sports achievements also.
Oh, yeah, exactly. They play especially sports played a big part and plays a big part in the history of Serbia and played a big part in the history of Yugoslavia. Speaking about the future for a change, where do you see yourself in 10 years?
If we are still around, because you mentioned the Cold War too, which I think in some ways it's could lead to a third world war. We don't know, but if I'm still around and there's a pandemic which is not entirely over yet, I hope to be talking to you or somebody else about my next book, which I plan to start working on once I have finished the army book, which we talked about. And at the moment, I have two ideas for that book, but I would not reveal now. So let's keep your audience waiting for 10 years, and we can talk about that. So in other words, I hope to have finished by that time what would be my sixth or fifth or sixth book, monograph, and hopefully also in an academic post. This is also by no means certain in the present climate. So.
Speaking about your vocation, one thing we missed to mention, apart from checking the MBA results, and not every day in the office is the same. If I would ask you, and I'm going to ask you, what is the single most important thing that you love in your vocation? What would you say?
Freedom. I have a complete freedom to research what I want, freedom to teach courses that I can change my modules every few years, depending on what kind of research I do at that particular time. Freedom to kind of think without any other considerations. And this may sound, so what? This is a given, but it's not. There are fellow historians in many other countries who don't have this luxury. So even in the region which we come from, there are different political pressures, maybe less so than before, but nevertheless they're there. And I think this freedom that I have is maybe the most important thing, and something that I enjoy most.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I know you already mentioned it, but it would be good maybe to summarize it before we close. If I would ask you to finish the following sentence, history is important because you would say?
History is important because it helps us understand why we are here today, how we got here today. I don't think there is this cliche that we can learn from history. We can't really, because history doesn't exist somewhere as some divine category, so we can learn from it. History doesn't exist outside of us. History would not exist if historians would not write it. So history is really us. History is around us. So that's why it's important.
Speaking about that, I actually have one very interesting follow-up question that I forgot to include in the set of questions I intended to ask you. That's about the cyclical history. Do you support that theory that actually history comes in cycles, or maybe even if you support it or do not support it, what do you think about it? Is it something that we should pay attention to, or completely disregard because it's only our interpretation of the history and nothing more?
When you say comes in cycles, I mean, you mean history kind of repeats itself. I don't think so. Contexts are always different, but it's true that we can actually we can make certain analogies with previous times. You asked me about the Cold War and Cold War 2.0, and I think I answered that. I mean, So we have just come out of the long centenary celebrations of centenary of the First World War between 2014-2018, and during this period there have been attempts even by some excellent historians to kind of make some direct analogies between the world of 1914 and our time, and I was not always convinced actually. So thinking of Serbia, for instance, which is the subject of my new book, I don't think that Serbia of 1914 is the same society as Serbia of 2014 or Serbia of 2022, because we have to take into account what happened subsequently, the two world wars, the huge sacrifices in those wars, the Yugoslav experience, the experience of dictatorship, both royal and communist, of course, the war of the Yugoslav succession of the 1990s and so on. But there's certain analogies that one could make. I'm sorry, this is not a very good and kind of neat answer, but history doesn't always have actually easy answers. So I think that we can make analogies, but it does not repeat itself. Contexts are always different.
Dan, before we close, any last words, anything else you would like to mention at this point of time?
No, just I'm very, very pleased to have learned about the trust, and this is a great work that you guys are doing. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope glad if I could have helped a little bit in this way. But I'm looking forward to seeing this published, and also to other interviews that you will do probably in the future. So that's all. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for being my guest on the RNT podcast.
Thank you.